In the dimly lit studio of a global news network, the world watched as breaking news hit the airwaves. Charlie Kirk, outspoken American political commentator, had been targeted in an attempted assassination during a visit to West Africa. The broadcast room went silent as anchor voices cracked with uncertainty, and speculation swirled like wildfire online. But amidst the chaos, one name trended alongside Kirk's: Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Reporters scrambled to connect the dots. What was Kirk doing in Burkina Faso? Why had he publicly challenged Traoré's leadership just days before? Footage had recently surfaced of Kirk questioning African sovereignty and suggesting the continent's freedom struggles were manufactured distractions funded by foreign adversaries. The backlash had been instant, and now, with Kirk lying unconscious in a hospital bed, the global spotlight turned to Traoré. And then, Traoré spoke. In an emergency press conference held in Ouagadougou, with the African Union and world media present, Traoré's voice rang calm and unwavering. He opened with a moment of silence, then delivered a shockwave of a statement. "We do not celebrate violence against those we disagree with. I offer prayers for Mr. Kirk's recovery, but justice must be served. Anyone who dares to destabilize our peace through terror will face the most unforgiving consequence: execution." Gasps echoed through the room. This wasn't diplomacy, this was judgment. And it was absolute. Was this a message to the attacker? Or a broader warning to foreign powers meddling in African affairs? Social media erupted with debate. Some praised Traoré's firmness. Others feared it signaled a new era of ruthless justice. One thing was clear: Traoré had flipped the narrative. From accused to avenger, the cameras had barely cooled from the press conference when global leaders began weighing in. Some praised Traoré's unwavering stance, calling it a model of principled leadership. Others condemned his call for execution, branding it authoritarian and brutal. But Traoré didn't flinch. His message wasn't aimed at appeasing the West, it was a rallying cry to Africa. While Charlie Kirk's condition remained critical, speculation grew around the motive behind the attack. Burkinabe intelligence hinted at foreign operatives, outsiders using media figures like Kirk to provoke instability and delegitimize rising African powers. Conspiracy or truth? Traoré didn't wait for confirmation. Instead, he stood before a crowd of youth in Ouagadougou and delivered a fiery speech. They send voices cloaked in freedom to dismantle ours. Let this be clear: we do not kneel to microphones wrapped in arrogance. We write our own legacy, not one ghostwritten by empires. Crowds erupted in chants of "Africa rises." Flags waved. His words weren't just a political statement, they became a movement. But the world wasn't done watching. In Washington, talk show hosts debated whether Traoré's power was going unchecked. Headlines asked, "Is Africa's new generation turning its back on diplomacy?" Meanwhile, Traoré was busy turning his back on fear. He didn't just want the attacker brought to justice, he wanted the world to know there would be no more tolerance for covert invasions disguised as concern. Kirk's near-death experience had ignited a global firestorm, and whether he intended it or not, he had become a symbol, one that Traoré had seized and reframed into a stark ultimatum. You come for our peace with violence, you leave with judgment. In that moment, it was no longer just about a man or a mission. It was a showdown between two worlds, one clinging to control, and the other refusing to be controlled. As Charlie Kirk's team broke their silence, releasing a shaky statement from his hospital bed, the tone was cautious, even fearful. "We don't know who did this," Kirk's spokesperson said, "but we won't be silenced." The West leaned into the narrative of a victimized voice, trying to cast Kirk as a martyr for freedom of speech. But in Ouagadougou, Traoré wasn't buying it. He stood before reporters and made a chilling declaration. "Let them spin their stories. While they count tweets, we count coffins. Their media is not a shield. It's a sword, and it just got stuck in the wrong battlefield." The room went silent. No apologies. No soft diplomacy, just raw fire. Burkina Faso's government released classified documents that, according to them, linked certain Western foundations to disinformation campaigns and undercover destabilization efforts. One name in those papers? A media entity affiliated with Kirk's movement. Coincidence, or something darker? Rather than backing down, Traoré pushed forward. He invited African leaders to a summit titled "Sovereignty or Servitude, Africa's Choice." And in the opening keynote, he pointed directly at Kirk's attack. When one of theirs falls, the world mourns. But when thousands of ours bleed from their meddling, we're told to stay quiet. Not anymore. Outside, massive crowds had gathered. Billboards flashed with bold slogans. Africa will not be silenced. Justice is not a Western privilege. The conversation had shifted. It wasn't just about Kirk's recovery, it was about the centuries-old imbalance of whose lives get global attention, and whose are ignored. And while the world tried to frame Traoré's demands for justice as a threat, his people saw something different. A man who refused to let power speak unchallenged, even when it wore a suit, smiled for cameras, and cried foul at the first sign of resistance. As the world reeled from the attempted assassination of Charlie Kirk, the West pushed its narrative harder. Talk shows blared with headlines like, "Is Africa a safe place for political discourse?" Pundits on every major American network painted Traoré as an extremist, feeding a growing anti-Western sentiment. But Traoré? He didn't flinch. He leaned in. In a nationally broadcast statement, standing firm under Burkina Faso's flag, he said, "If defending our land, our voice, and our dignity makes me a threat, then yes, I am one. And if justice means protecting only one side, then your justice is counterfeit." The message was crystal clear: Africa would not be put on trial for an act it didn't orchestrate, especially not by the same powers that had long destabilized it. And while Western commentators demanded apologies, Traoré issued none. Instead, he ordered the formation of a Pan-African Commission on Media Manipulation and Foreign Influence, a move that sent a ripple of fear through think tanks and lobbying groups across Europe and the US. Burkina Faso is just the beginning, Traoré declared in a press briefing. From Cape Town to Cairo, we are done playing the fool in someone else's story. As tensions escalated, footage surfaced of Traoré visiting the site of a recent drone strike in Mali, one allegedly linked to foreign intelligence operations. Surrounded by survivors, he offered no blanket statements of peace. Just this: "You taught us silence. Now hear our thunder." What emerged wasn't just a geopolitical standoff, it was a media war, a battle for narrative dominance. And in that war, Traoré was proving himself not just as a soldier, but as a storyteller whose voice could shake global perception. 2 days after his explosive press briefing, Traoré made an unannounced appearance on an international panel about global security, broadcast live. Sitting among Western diplomats, analysts, and media figures, he looked out of place, not because of his uniform, but because of the unfiltered clarity in his eyes. Charlie Kirk's assassination attempt was the elephant in the room. Western panelists danced around it, eager to condemn without evidence. One commentator, visibly uncomfortable, said, "Africa needs to acknowledge how this incident reflects growing instability." That was it. Traoré leaned forward. "Instability," he echoed, his voice calm, but slicing through the room like a blade. "What do you call 500 years of colonial looting? What do you call the installation of puppet regimes? Or the economic traps laid by institutions built in your image? That isn't instability, that's strategy." The room froze. Some tried to interrupt, but he pressed on. "When one of your own is attacked, it is a crisis. But when hundreds of Africans are killed by foreign drones, it's a security operation. When a Western leader prays for peace, it's noble. When I pray for justice, it's threatening." Social media exploded in real time. Clips of Traoré's confrontation with the panel were edited, subtitled, shared, and memed in seconds. Hashtags like #TraorSpeakstrith and #JusticeNotJustUs started trending in France, the US, and most notably, across all of West Africa. Even Charlie Kirk's own fanbase began to fracture online. Some demanded investigations. Others began questioning everything they'd been told about Africa, about Traoré, about power. Traoré had done what no military leader had done in decades. He didn't just fight back, he made the world listen. And in doing so, he was no longer just defending Burkina Faso. He was redefining the battlefield. That same evening, a leaked audio clip hit social media. A White House aide could be heard whispering, "Traoré's influence is becoming dangerous. He's not just fighting wars, he's rewriting narratives." By morning, the entire media ecosystem was spinning. Commentators labeled Traoré a rising authoritarian, a military populist, and even a threat to global order. But the people, especially across the global south, heard something different. In a pre-recorded video statement, Traoré responded directly to the Western media frenzy. He stood alone beneath the Burkinabe flag, eyes unflinching, his voice resolute. "They call me dangerous because I speak where they hoped for silence. They fear my words more than my weapons." He continued, "To the people of the world, I am not your enemy. But if you aim to chain Africa again, you'll find the continent has grown teeth." That phrase, "the continent has grown teeth," hit like a thunderclap. It was echoed in protests in Mali, Senegal, Congo, and even among African diaspora communities in Paris, London, and New York. Murals with Traoré's face began appearing on walls in cities he'd never visited. He was being mythologized, not by his order, but by collective frustration finally finding a face. In response, a Fox News panel asked, "Is Traoré radicalizing Africa against the West?" But what they didn't understand, or chose not to, was that Africa hadn't been radicalized by Traoré. It had been awakened by centuries of broken promises, stolen futures, and manufactured silence. Traoré just gave the silence a voice. And that voice was echoing now across parliaments, city streets, classrooms, and war rooms. Forcing the world to confront a truth it had long ignored. Africa wasn't kneeling anymore. The world watched in stunned silence as Traoré took the stage at the African Union Emergency Summit. He wasn't scheduled to speak, he took the mic, cameras zoomed in, diplomats leaned forward, and somewhere in Washington, alerts started firing. "I have heard your questions," Traoré said, voice cutting through the chamber. "You ask if Africa is turning its back on old allies. But I ask, were they ever allies at all?" Gasps rippled through the room. Macron looked visibly agitated. A U.S. delegate scribbled notes. Traoré pressed on. "You want trade? So do we, but not in chains. You want peace? Then stop fueling war. You want loyalty? Then earn it. Not with aid wrapped in arrogance. Not with promises that taste like poison." A hush fell over the summit. His words weren't rehearsed, they were raw, dangerous, alive. Across social media, clips of the speech exploded. One TikTok edit captioned, "This is not a president. This is a thunderstorm." In Nairobi, Johannesburg, Accra, cafes erupted in cheers. Meanwhile, in Western media, commentators spun panic. Is Traoré leading a geopolitical rebellion? Burkina Faso goes rogue, and others may follow. But the real shift wasn't political, it was psychological. People who had once felt small now saw themselves reflected in a leader who didn't flinch. For the first time in decades, Africa wasn't asking to be seen, it was demanding to be heard. That night, a journalist asked Traoré, "Aren't you afraid this makes you a target?" He smiled faintly, looked into the lens, and said, "You can aim at me. But you cannot kill a continent that has found its voice." The White House issued a vague but pointed statement. "We urge African leaders to consider the long-term consequences of isolating traditional allies." It didn't name names. It didn't have to. The subtext screamed Traoré. Hours later, Traoré addressed the press. No podium. No teleprompter. Just a handheld mic, a crowd, and a continent watching. Consequences, he began, eyes scanning the crowd. You've burned our forests. You've mined our land. You've erased our history. We've already paid your price. Now it's time you paid attention. A wave of applause surged. The silence that followed was electric. He wasn't just speaking to the people, he was channeling them. He continued. You come to our lands with contracts hidden in smiles. You speak of partnership while your drones circle overhead. You ask for peace, but only on your terms. Well, those days are over. From Nairobi to Dakar, radio stations replayed his speech on loop. In Paris and London, analysts debated what Traoré represented, populism or principle. But inside Burkina Faso, the people knew the truth, he represented them. International outlets tried to smear him. One Western paper called him a destabilizing force with a messiah complex. The next day, youth across Ouagadougou spray-painted on city walls. Destabilize the chains. Build the future. And they weren't just tagging walls, they were building movements. Student unions, farmer cooperatives, even ex-military groups began openly backing Traoré's doctrine. Africa doesn't need handlers. It needs its hands unshackled. The geopolitical center of gravity was shifting. Not in silence, but with a voice that refused to be toned down. And Traoré? He ended his speech with a smile, raising two fingers, not in peace, but in defiance. A leaked recording from a closed-door summit rattled every newsroom. Traoré is a phase. He'll be replaced like all the rest, said a high-ranking European diplomat. But Traoré wasn't interested in anonymous threats or veiled condescension. That night, he went live, not from a marble hall or sterile studio, but standing atop a military vehicle in the heart of Ouagadougou. You call me a phase, he said, looking directly into the camera. Good. Because phases reshape history. He wasn't surrounded by security detail, he was surrounded by citizens. As lights from cell phones lit the crowd, Traoré raised his hand. You forget, he continued. Phases break tides. Phases erode empires. You've underestimated a people who've been underestimated for centuries. Western leaders scrambled to reframe his rise. Some called him dangerous. Others, irrational. But across Africa, the tide was turning. Regional leaders who had once kept a safe diplomatic distance began to issue cautious praise. One Central African minister tweeted. Maybe what we feared was not Traoré's fire, but our own reflection in his flame. In Europe, economic lobbies pressed their governments, engage or lose everything. Meanwhile, old colonial powers sent envoys bearing softened rhetoric. But it was too late. Burkina Faso was no longer simply a country in transition. It had become a symbol of rupture. Not because of arms or power, but because of language, and the clarity of a leader who no longer asked for a seat at the table, but flipped the table entirely. Back in the square, a journalist asked Traoré what he feared. He didn't blink. I fear silence. Silence kills more nations than war ever will. And in that moment, the world understood. This wasn't a man courting power. This was a movement in the shape of a man. The world had been watching, but now it was listening. After weeks of tension, allegations, and diplomatic veils, Ibrahim Traoré took the stage at the Pan-African Congress in Dakar. Delegates from over 30 African nations had gathered. Cameras flashed. Global news anchors leaned in. Traoré stepped up, holding no notes, flanked by no aides. They say Africa is unstable, he began. But instability doesn't come from within. It's imported, in crates marked, aid and advice. The room was silent. Even seasoned politicians seemed frozen. He walked across the stage slowly. The West once came for our minerals. Then our minds. Now, they want our memory. To rewrite us into footnotes in their story. Then, without warning, he played a video. It showed leaked conversations of a foreign advisor calling African unity a fever dream, and suggesting controlled chaos as the best strategy for the continent. The room erupted. Some slammed fists on tables. Others stood in outrage. A few Western envoys quietly slipped out the back. When the screen went black, Traoré turned to the crowd. You want sovereignty? Then let's stop asking for permission to define ourselves. He didn't name enemies. He didn't have to. After the speech, headlines rolled in. Traoré lights fire under African sovereignty debate. Burkina Faso leader forces reckoning at global stage. A new voice of the continent emerges. In private circles, foreign leaders debated economic retaliation. But even they knew. Punishment would only validate his warnings. And in cafes from Accra to Algiers, people spoke differently that night. A little prouder. A little louder. Because for once, Africa wasn't being spoken about. It was speaking for itself. And leading the charge was a man who didn't just speak truth to power, he made power listen. We are not the shadows of empires past. We are the flame of tomorrow. With those words, Ibrahim Traoré turned away from the podium. The weight of centuries, colonial scars, economic chains, and foreign manipulation, had been challenged not with bullets, but with truth, clarity, and unshakable resolve. The room, once filled with murmurs of doubt and distraction, now pulsed with silence. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Traoré didn't need applause. He wasn't there to entertain. He was there to remind the world, and especially his continent, that Africa doesn't have to rise. It already has. He walked off the stage not as a president pleading for recognition, but as a commander of consciousness. His steps echoed louder than any speech delivered that day. In the minds of millions, from city streets to rural villages, one message lingered. Africa bows to no empire. We write our own chapter now. And as the global stage dimmed, one light refused to fade. The fire Traoré had ignited.